Hong Kong has been under PRC jurisdiction since 1997, when the British government handed over its final major colony to the Chinese government to much pomp and ceremony. To the tune of Auld Lang Syne, the British colonial flag was lowered, and the lotus flag of the Hong Kong SAR was raised. 8 years beforehand, an event happened in China which brought fear to the Hong Konger people, what the Chinese media refers to as the 4th of June incident, but is alternatively known to the West as the Tiananmen Square massacre. In the events that unfolded, with a military crackdown on the pro-democracy protesters, around 1,000 people died. The events have been heavily suppressed by the Chinese press, and as a result, most mainland Chinese have a pro-government view of the protest, if they have one at all. In Hong Kong, the situation is quite the reverse. Hong Kong in the late 1980s was still under British jurisdiction. Hong Kong at the time was the last major colony of the British Empires, and while Hong Kongers had previously engaged in pro-communist protests, such as the 1967 riots, which led to over 50 deaths and over 1,000 arrests, since that point the British government had invested in regaining the trust of the people of Hong Kong, improving living standards, reducing corruption, and introducing advisory bodies, as full universal suffrage was opposed at that time by the communist government on the mainland. The Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 laid out a roadmap for the handover of the territory, and the basic law, a constitution for Hong Kong, was drafted. The citizens of Hong Kong at that time had a relatively neutral view towards handover. This all changed in 1989. After 3 months of student-led protests, the Chinese government brought in the so-called People's Liberation Army to shut down the demonstrations and restore order. Over 1,000 people died and thousands were injured, a clear contrast to the British response to the protests in Hong Kong in the 1960s. The public in Hong Kong were mortified. Hundreds of thousands fled the city-state over the next 8 years, many going to Britain, Singapore, Canada and the United States. Demand for further democratisation also grew, especially in the traditionally conservative, functional constituencies. Hong Kongers voted 2/3 for the Liberal or pro-democracy bloc in the 1991 elections, and the British government brought in Chris Patten as Governor of Hong Kong to bring in further electoral reforms to the Legislative Council, or LegCo, in the face of opposition from the mainland Chinese government, where the state media painted him as a villain. In the next 3 years after the handover, many reforms were rolled back by the unelected Provisional LegCo appointed by the Communist government. The system was then rigged in a way which would help ensure that pro-Beijing politicians won the LegCo, as they have done in every election since. The Beijing government has also been accused of sending immigrants from the mainland to Hong Kong who are more likely to vote for the pro-Beijing parties. Electoral reform since then has only occasionally come up. A round of reforms proposed by the Hong Kong government in 2014 were met with protests, the so-called umbrella movement. Candidates which want independence for Hong Kong from the mainland are banned from running for office, such as the leader of the League of Social Democrats, Avery Ng. All of these events led us to today, where the people of Hong Kong fear a Chinese military intervention by the Hong Kong government. The protests in Hong Kong have gone on for over 2 months and have caused the closure of Hong Kong's international airport, the LegCo and parts of the metro system. In response, the authorities have used tear gas and are increasingly desperate for the protests to end. Every year on the 4th of June, the people of Hong Kong held a candlelit vigil in memory of those who lost their lives at Tiananmen Square in 1989. One can simply wonder whether or not the increasingly confrontational atmosphere in Hong Kong was inevitable, or whether one decision made by the People's Republic of China in 1989 fated Hong Kong to its current path that it's on today.